Hello world, welcome back to Razor RC. Today I'm making a video about the Losi Tenacity. I've got the monster truck here in front of us, but this should also apply to the short course truck, the desert buggy, and the truggy. They're all pretty much the same platform and for the most part have the same problems too. So what this video is 7 tips, tricks, improvements, fixes, whatever you want to call them, for your Losi Tenacity. I've been driving this truck for about a month now. Noticed several things that I did not like about the truck, some weaknesses, flaws, and so I went about fixing those flaws, and now it's a pretty good truck. So number one, right off the bat, out of the box, my ESC was just flopping around. So as delivered by Horizon Hobby, my ESC was detached. Looked like they tried to servo tape it from the factory, but it just wasn't really working. So I had to remedy that. So this truck actually comes in 2 versions. The initial versions had these ESCs with like little ears on the side, so you could actually bolt them onto the ESC tray on both sides of the ESC. Later ESCs, they revised the firmware and they removed those ears for whatever reason. I'm not really sure if they were breaking or what, but they no longer bolt them onto the ESC tray and you have to servo tape them. Problem is, this ESC tray was not really designed to be servo taped. It actually has channels and grooves in the face of the ESC tray, so the ESC doesn't really fit flush up against it. And so to actually servo tape it, you go through a few different things. So the first thing you do is you definitely want to clean the ESC tray with some isopropyl alcohol, let that dry, make sure it's nice and clean. Then you want to lay down strips inside those channels. And I use 3M wall mounting tape, double-sided tape. It's like 30 pounds of weight load capacity or something like that. It's really sticky, really good stuff, and it's been holding on quite well. So you want to lay down strips within those channels so that you fill in those gaps, and then you want to lay down one nice flat sheet all the way across the entire tray and then mount your ESC on. And before you actually affix the last layer of servo tape, I highly recommend you actually just heat it up a little bit with like a lighter, just for like a few seconds, get it like nice and warm. It'll get a little more gummy and then it'll adhere a lot better onto your ESC and onto your ESC tray. And then you want to actually let that cure overnight. That servo tape, it's not really meant for immediate use. You want to let it dry, let it sit for a little while, and then it should be nice and tight. And I've crashed this thing in some pretty crazy jumps and flips and stuff like that, and it hasn't fallen off, so it's working out pretty well. So that's tip number 1, just to get your truck up and running. And then actually another quick follow on to that, the on-off button here, the on-off switch, it normally mounts up here on the front. I recommend running it sideways, because otherwise when you crash into stuff, actually the switch will tend to move on its own in high-speed collisions and stuff. So mounting it sideways means that switch won't turn off all by itself, which is pretty annoying when you're running and your truck turns off by itself. Okay, tip number 2 is to gear down. Okay, so one of the major flaws with the Tenacity line is it runs this Dynamite Fuse 3800 kV motor. It's really not the ideal motor for this type of vehicle. It's like a high RPM 4-pole motor. 3800 kV means basically for every volt of battery. So if you're running like a 8.4 volt 2-cell LiPo, you're putting 8.4 volts to the motor. 8.4 volts times 3800 kVs is basically what the RPMs the motor will spin at. And that's just actually a really high number. 3800 for a 2S, 3S capable motor is just really high. This is more of like a high RPM, low torque motor. And what you really want in something like this is like a high torque motor with maybe not as many RPMs. So maybe like a 3000, 3200 kV motor would be a lot more appropriate. But unfortunately, Horizon in their infinite wisdom decided to supply this motor for this truck. But you can kind of help things along. So it definitely runs quite hot out of the box, even on 2S. You're talking stuff in the 160, 170, maybe in 180 degree range, depending on how you're driving and how hot it is outside. Gearing it down will help a lot. So Tenacity MT originally came with a 14-tooth pinion when they originally released this truck. Later versions come with a 12-tooth pinion, and even that's still a little bit on the high side, so I geared mine all the way down to 11-tooth, which is the smallest you can fit. 11 tooth pinion dropped the temps by about 10 degrees. So now it's running more in the 150s, maybe low 160s range, which is a lot better than the 160s to 170s range. Definitely the biggest weakness of this truck, and gearing it down will allow you to use the revs a little more than trying to torque its way around corners and over stuff. The analogy I like to use is something like putting a Yamaha R1 motorcycle engine into a car. So like a Yamaha R1 motor probably puts out somewhere around 180 horsepower, but it's meant for like a 400-pound motorcycle, right? It's not meant for like a 3,000-pound car. Even though 180 horsepower sounds like a lot, it's really not going to move a car, because it's designed to run at like 12, 13, 14,000 RPM, not at like 3,000 RPM and trying to push a big heavy vehicle. So similar to that, you want to use the revs to move the vehicle and not the torque. Okay, fix number 3 that I found important is that the stock body on this Tenacity MT lasted about 1 battery pack. It's pretty much complete garbage. It's made out of paper. One serious crash and it was completely destroyed. So you will need to get a new body. So for Tenacity MT, I'm running this. This is a Proline Chevy C10 body. You need a 1/8 scale body, which is the proper size to fit this truck. The Tenacity MT and pretty much all the Tenacities are pretty much slash dimensions. They're short course truck dimensions. So the length, the width, the wheelbase, everything is basically short course truck sized. And so you need a 1/8 sized monster truck body. This is meant, I think, for like an e-Revo or a Revo 2.5 or something like that. But one little tip about the body, whatever you select, is to pick something with kind of a tapering nose. So the Chevy C10 body is actually a pretty square body. I had to cut down these fenders quite a bit. As you can see, there's pretty much no fenders at all. And the reason for that is because on this particular truck, let's see if I can get the angle right. It looks like there's a lot of clearance and stuff, but as soon as you turn the wheels, you can see the tires are going to jut into where the body normally sits. And then especially when you compress the suspension, it's basically going to go right into where that wheel well is. So I recommend trying to find something that's tapered in the front, at least if you're running the Tenacity MT with these big tires. Otherwise, you're going to have to trim a lot of the body off to prevent it from rubbing. So that's tip number 3 on the new body. Tip number 4 is to use some battery straps. So another problem I had with this truck is that when I was running my 3-cell battery, it fits inside this battery compartment here. It was just way too heavy, and landing big jumps basically just smashed through this little latch here. So normally you have this little latch, you close it, it's made out of plastic, it prevents stuff from popping back out. But in my particular case, the 3S battery was just heavy enough to just smash through that little latch, basically broke it off, and then my battery door is just flopping open. So these little plastic latches are not the greatest. They should have made them out of metal or something. They can break if you have a heavy 3-cell battery. I think on 2-cell it's not that bad. I didn't really have any problems, but as soon as I went to a big heavy 3-cell battery, it broke on the very first run. Maybe you've seen that video actually. So what I recommend doing is getting some battery straps. So basically strap it to the top here of the battery compartment. That will keep it nice and secure and prevent it from punching down through that battery door. It makes it even more annoying to hook up your battery, because you basically got to change that, turn that latch, stick in the battery, come on the other side, plug it in from the top, and then you got to loop the battery straps around, close the door, and then close that latch, and then you're finally ready to go after about 12 minutes of fiddling. So that's tip number 4. I pretty much are running all battery straps all the time, even on 2-cell batteries. I'm running them just to mount them a little more securely. The other nice thing is it also removes those little foam stickies that they've got to space out 2-cell batteries out to 3S size. That way you don't have to add or remove those little foam spacers. You can just run the battery straps all the time and not have that issue. Okay, tip number 5. Even gearing it down, this motor's still going to run a bit hot. I do recommend running like a heat sink or a fan or both ideally. You can either get a heat sink that mounts like this, you get a heat sink fan combination that mounts on top. I don't think the Hobbywing one will fit, the C1 combo, because it's just a little too close to the outdrives here, but maybe some of the other brands. I haven't really tried it. The other thing you could do is mount a little fan mount here, like an L bracket or something, and then mount a fan, you know, blowing air against the motor there. This thing just runs hot. Part of the problem is that there's no airflow hitting this motor, because everything up front is blocking the air all the way through this motor mount, and basically air just kind of passes over the motor rather than hit the motor directly. So I do recommend some sort of measure to drop the temps even more, because that's really the main issue with this truck. Heat is the enemy. Okay, tip number 6. Again, one of the annoying things about this battery tray, as if there aren't enough already, is that the battery door tends to just kind of push through into the battery compartment if you don't have a battery in there. So when you're just kind of carrying this thing around, or maybe you're using a 2-cell battery and have it mounted up top with the battery straps, well, there's nothing really between the battery and the battery door, and so if you kind of push up from underneath, it tends to just kind of pop through the chassis, so it'll just kind of keep going. So something I recommend is putting a couple little battery stops here. So I just drilled a couple little 2mm holes. I'm using, 1.5mm holes, and I'm using 2mm screws with some washers. And basically, so what that does is just press against the corner of the battery tray so that that battery door just doesn't try to pop through. The chassis does have a little bit of these little plastic wedges in the corner to try to hold that battery door back, but I found that those basically wore down really fast. So using little metal washers and a little metal screws helps quite a bit, and actually is now a lot more of a permanent solution there. So that's tip number 6. Little battery door stops so your battery tray doesn't just pop through. And the last tip on this vehicle is that this Dynamite Fuse ESC is actually a rebranded Hobbywing. So what that means is you can use a Hobbywing program card, one like this, the LED version. Just makes it a lot more handy to program this ESC. There are actually a lot of functionality within that ESC. You can adjust the vehicle to drive how you like. You can change things like drag, brake, timing, etc. So it's quite convenient to be able to program that without having to just like hold down the on-off buttons and stuff like that. So the Hobbywing program card will work. It's fully compatible. It only costs like $9 or $10. I'll put down a link in the description, and you can pick one of these up as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it. 7 tips for your Losi Tenacity. Pretty much applies to all the Tenacity vehicles, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, share with your friends, post them on the forums, post them on Facebook, etc. All that stuff helps me quite a bit, and thanks for watching. Look for more videos soon.